political theory. Erin Williams, who I know lots of people will know due to her work with Feed UK, which is pretty unmissable if you follow these issues now. And she's going to be talking about the question of food insecurity. And then online from Germany, we have Dr. Vera Wilde, who's going to be talking about the issues from a more statistical, biological perspective, focusing specifically on neonates, mothers and harm, especially focusing on the mandate to exclusively breastfeed. So those are our three presentations. Our panelists are then going to have a little bit of commentary with each other, taking up any points they want to from each other's papers, and then we can continue the discussion. Okay, so Lina, do you want to start us off?
What I want to start by saying thank you so much for inviting me. This is really, really wonderful to be here. And if there are any of the students in here and I submit to our paper, I apologize. And I hope it wasn't too painful. So the reason I'm here is because two of my political theorist colleagues and I from different universities, but we kind of knew each other a little bit, came together to talk about what seemed to be very problematic to us about the breastfeeding promotion campaigns that we came across in hospitals. In fact, it started with the first person who reacted to this was Peter Bayerland, was one of the co-authors. And he wrote in Tiziana and me, and we all went, what? Because we hadn't had our babies at that point, and it's when you have your first child, most of the time we become across this. And we quickly had babies, all three of us after this, and we were right in the middle of it. So we're political theorists, which means that we don't have a background in any kind of the medical issues. We had tried to read up as much as we could on this, but we are at heart political theorists. And this paper is about through a political theory point of view of what should the state be doing, in particular, what should a liberal state be doing? So the kinds of campaigns that we came across will be familiar to all. It's public advertising, marketing campaigns with messages of the sort of breastfeeding is natural, breastfeeding is not good for the baby, and even formula feeding the baby is dangerous. I've added a couple of photos here to illustrate some of the claims that I'm sure you're familiar with. These particular claims came out of the American government officials, their statements, likening formula feeding your baby is risky in sort of the same way as riding a mechanical bull when you're pregnant, or is risky or harmful the same way that smoking when you're pregnant is harmful. So really, really strong danger messages. The state isn't really doing this. It's not the state. Here there were these statements were given by government officials, but most of the time the state is not really making these kinds of statements, but it is funding and cooperating very closely with NGOs who are making these statements. So supporting and funding, providing space for, and even channeling some of the, or delegating some of the public health work to these NGOs. So for example, the American Breastfeeding Association, or I had all my kids in Australia, so it was the Australian Breastfeeding Association, but very similar kinds of marketing campaigns. And they, as you know, rather aggressively promote breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding. There's also, in Australia and in some other countries, the baby-friendly hospital initiative. Sure, it goes under different names in different countries, but the point is that in order to be baby-friendly, and I was struggling a bit to think about what a non-baby-friendly hospital would be, but a baby-friendly hospital should promote breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding, and should discourage any kind of information or support for formula feeding babies. So the state has an active role in promoting exclusive breastfeeding in these examples, even though the state does not necessarily do much of that promoting itself directly. And the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative usually models that a newborn mother gets a huge pile of pamphlets about exclusive breastfeeding. Those pamphlets are come from this, say, the American Breastfeeding Association or the Australian Breastfeeding Associations, from the NGOs. And there's a helpline in case you're not getting that exclusive breastfeeding to work properly, line that you can call to get help, and that helpline goes to these NGOs in many cases. So in that way, there isn't a strict distinction between what the state is doing or what the NGOs are doing in the name of the state. Our argument is, very briefly, that the state shouldn't be doing this. And for three basic reasons. One is it violates basic Chinese principles. The second is it can undermine autonomy, which we've already talked about today. And the third is it violates the neutrality of the liberal. Now I want to make two little notes before I get into the details. I've tried to explain the way we think about why we focus on this breastfeeding promotion campaigns, even though the state is not directly behind them, right? But our focus is on the role of the state actors, not on forbidding NGOs doing what NGOs are doing according to their own purpose. But our focus is the role of the state in supporting and giving space and legitimacy to these NGOs and whatever. And obviously, it feels a bit sad that I need to point this out, and probably I don't need to point this out in this audience, but I wasn't quite aware of the audience when I put together the slides. We are not anti-breastfeeding. So, when we started thinking about this, as the kind of political theorists or political philosophers that we are, we started with thinking about general principles for the liberal state. And it was quite obvious already at that point that these campaigns would be a bit problematic. So one of the principles that a liberal state should adhere to is it should not, unless for very good reasons, further increase economic gender inequality. The second principle is that it should not engage in manipulation and in outways or undermine autonomy. And third, the state should be neutral between different perceptions of life. That means that if the state is going to intervene in people's choices on the basis of claims about health, then those claims need to be very, very much evidence-based. They must not be based on claims like, this is natural motherhood, this is good motherhood, and other kinds of notions of what it means to be a good woman or a good mother. But we wanted to dig a bit deeper than this, right? We could come up with general principles for the liberal state, but we wanted to dig a bit deeper. Surely there must be literature on health ethics that will help flesh out. So we went looking to the public health ethics literature and to the health promotion literature, which might be very familiar to some of you. The public health literature, or the public health ethics literature, has a particular focus most of the time. So it is about coercive measures to protect third parties. So a typical example will be during the pandemics that we just had. If you force a lockdown, that restricts people's freedom, right? Then that's a coercive measure, and the idea is to protect third parties. And that triggers a lot of concerns about justice. Some of those discussions we've actually had in relation to the last pandemic that we just sat through. Now, health promotion literature has a different kind of focus, because the focus here is on voluntary measures to protect the agent themselves. Okay? So typical examples would be Lina, do more exercise, eat less chocolate, and drink less wine, and add some more broccoli to your diet. That would be a typical kind of health promotion advice. The breastfeeding campaigns, interestingly enough, falls, as we say in Swedish, falls between the chairs, which means there isn't a literature where it sits comfortably. And that, I think, and we think, is part of the reason why it attracts so little attention, despite these issues really triggering a lot of the concerns that go on in these literatures. Because it is about voluntary measures, or as I would argue later on, purportedly voluntary measures to protect third parties. There's a kind of a mix. So here are some principles that come out of the public health ethics literature. I'll read them because they're quite small. The first one is, if there's more than one possible way to achieve the goal, always choose the least liberty-infringing one. Because remember, this is about coercion methods, so they want the least coercion as possible. More than one possible way to achieve your goal, choose the one that is the least liberty-infringing. Second, liberty-infringing intervention should be used in a non-discriminatory way. Be particularly cautious about using interventions when those are singled out by it come from the worst of groups of society. 3, the burdens should be as minimal as possible. And 4, those who bear the burden to become. There's a 5th here. And that principle sometimes goes under the name of reciprocity. I had a discussion. If a public health intervention meets the above conditions, it is at least liberty-infringing alternative, it's used in a non-discriminatory way, that's not singling out the already disadvantaged groups. The burdens are as minimal as possible, and those who bear the burdens are compensated. Then it is still the case that if the state tells a group of people, you guys should bear the burdens of restricting your liberty, of carrying burdens for the sake of those people over there, that the state needs to make sure that those people are asked or required to bear those burdens, are supported and helped in discharging their duties. That's the reciprocity. You have to do this, but we as the state will at least make sure that it is as easy as possible for you to do it. So public health literature is concerned with the just distribution of burdens and benefits. And that's completely missing in the breastfeeding. Another speculation that we have then is that it is that this purported voluntariness makes such concerns irrelevant. Because in the health promotion literature, there's not that much talk of justice, of who bears the burdens and how they should be compensated. But that's because the benefits, to me, of eating less chocolate and drinking less wine and eating more broccoli, those benefits come to me, right? So the idea here is that they don't need to talk about justice of bearing burdens when I am the one who benefits from bearing those burdens.
Come on, rainbow.
Motion literature brings up some ethical principles that make the breastfeeding promotion campaigns look, shall we say, a bit problematic, right? So one of those principles is respect autonomy as well as doing good. The doing good in this case is making people like me eat less chocolate and drink less wine and exercise more and so on. And that's a value, right? That's what they're trying to achieve. But they also need to respect autonomy. They can't do just anything to me in order to fix my lack of a proper diet and so on. And another principle that comes out of this is that do not cause fear, anxiety, and vulnerability unnecessarily. Now, both of those principles have less consensus than what seems to be the case with the principles from the public health literature. But almost everybody agrees, but there's a bigger disagreement on how to prioritize different values. But at least it's quite clear that there's quite a lot of support for respecting autonomy and for not using fear and anxiety causing messages unnecessarily anyway. And finally, we add a campaign should be efficient in achieving its goals. Because when we read through a lot of the medical literature on this, it seemed to us that it wasn't as clear cut as it was made out to be, that breastfeeding had all these enormous good consequences. There were such serious methodological problems, for example, of establishing that what you did at the infant time caused higher IQ when someone is 20 and so on. But I won't talk much about that today because there are other people in this room who are much better at that stuff. I'll stick to the political theory. But let's look at the implications for, in the case then, of the breastfeeding complaints. So we think there are three types of issues that arise from the breastfeeding case. One is the cost of activity itself. We were quite stunned by the claim that breastfeeding is free and easy. That's often in this pamphlet. Because it contradicts another message that's also often in these pamphlets, which is breastfeeding is a full-time job. And it's important that others think of it as a full-time job because otherwise they'll be frustrated. Those two can't be true at the same time. It's also the case that because of breastfeeding, it's very difficult to engage in paid employment. For some people, it's impossible. If you're in hospitality, for example, you can't just take 40 minutes out of your day at several times during the day to go pump and spread breast milk. And for others, like academics, it's difficult, but it's doable. Not to mention all the people who have to hide in the toilets trying to express breast milk and so on. But even if you're not trying to engage in paid employment, it can make it difficult to even leave the house. And we've talked about, Sana, you talked earlier today about the difficulties in the Icelandic situation of the opposite, of leaving the house while having to feed your baby formula. But in a lot of countries, it's still the opposite, right? So it seems no matter, even regardless of how that has turned, it's still the case. There are people who are finding it difficult to leave the house because of the shaming of how they had to feed their babies. There's sleep deprivation. There's a reason why sleep deprivation is used as a method of torture. And there's reports about the tactile overload, sometimes the extremely painful activity of feeding a baby with cracked and bleeding nipples and so on. The second type of aspects of this that problematic is the guilt, anxiety, and inadequacy that we already talked about today. The feeling like a failure when they stop trying to breastfeed. The worry about what health officials will say. Guilt and anxiety about being a bad mother or failing to do what's natural as a woman. Guilt and shame about endangering their children. And when reporting physical problems, the answer is often perseverance no matter what. And third, the start of a longer-term cycle. Because exclusive breastfeeding makes paid employment very, very difficult or even impossible, it often begins a vicious trend, right? And we know this. It's not news. It's not like our paper new to this. that vicious trend of the economic disadvantage, where the person who stays home to exclusively breastfeed is the person who bonds more closely and who is then expected to be the one who takes more time off. And employers are expecting the mothers to take time off, which means that the mothers will, even regardless of what they do, often advance less quickly in their careers, making them earning less, which makes it more rational for them to be the one who works part-time, and so on, establishing this very familiar spiral of economic disadvantage. It's okay to choose this, but it's not okay to make people choose this. That's a very important thing. So if we connect this back to the principles, what does the breastfeeding promotion campaign do? Well, they put all the burdens on one partner, right? All the burdens of feeding the baby on one partner. Further on, the partner that it puts all the burdens on is typically already economically disadvantaged in society. So that's a big no-no according to principle 1 and 2. There's no talk of compensation for the economic disadvantage, for example. In fact, speaking to principle number 1 from the public health ethics about you always use the least liberty infringing alternative if there are more than one. Here, there is an alternative, but there's actively disparaging the fashion of this alternative solution. Any kind of suggestions about how to minimize costs, how to share the burden of feeding, and so on, or distribute burdens more equally is shut down. And in fact, there's enormous pressure. We can't even have information about formula feeding. It undermines autonomy through restricting the mother's activities. Not only can she not normally engage in paid employment, but she's also engaging in exclusive breastfeeding. But she can't do her hobbies, she can't go to the gym, she can't hang out with friends, she can't do anything that keeps her away from the baby, especially not if she's doing feeding on demand. And it undermines autonomy also, not only by restricting what the mother can do, she basically becomes hostage for the period of the baby's life that she's exclusively breastfeeding, but it also undermines autonomy through using guilting, shaming, and scare tactics, which is a form of manipulation. And finally, promotes notions of good and natural motherhood. You might say, is breastfeeding really the problem? Perhaps in a better society, right? Breastfeeding would not impact negatively on people's economic opportunities. Well, I think it would still have some negative implications of promoting it as aggressively as we do. But it might be better. But still, notice this, even if you buy into that, then the state should focus on changing society rather than pressuring people to breastfeed exclusively in the society that we have right now. Because if you're pressuring them right now, once in a system that's set up in a way that makes it very difficult to engage in exclusive breastfeeding, very costly to do so, you violate that principle of reciprocity. That if you put burdens on people, then you also need to make it as easy and costless as possible for them to discharge those duties. So, to sum up, the breastfeeding promotion campaigns, engaging in those means that the state violates basic tenets of justice. It worsens gender inequality, and it violates principles of public health ethics. It undermines autonomy in various ways, by guilting and shaming mothers and by pushing them towards an activity that severely restricts what they can do. Right? For 6 months, maybe, they become hostage and they have to give up almost anything that they used to do outside of the home. You know, compare that with the arguments we had about lockdown during the pandemic, where nobody could leave the home, right? And finally, it violates state neutrality by promoting these particular notions of what's natural for women and what good motherhood is. And that, of course, feeds back into the discussions of undermining autonomy through manipulation and causing fear and anxiety and so on, as we talked about earlier. So, therefore, we think that the state should not engage in these breastfeeding promotion campaigns, and there's something seriously wrong with the way that this kind of campaigns are allowed to go on. Thank you so much.
Would you, Erin?
Thank you. So thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here to share with you all some of the research that we've been doing at FEED. And it's actually quite nice to follow on from Lina, because I think it's a very good example of where infant feeding policy gets it wrong. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the fantastic collaborators that we've worked with through doing our research, and in particular the women who have shared their stories and experiences with us. And throughout the presentation, you will see anonymised quotes from them, just highlighting some of the key issues that come up around this point. So to set the scene a wee bit, we got interested in infant food insecurity as an issue around 2018, when the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Infant Feeding and Inequalities, or APGIFI as it is known, conducted an inquiry looking at the impact of the cost of formula on families across the UK who could not afford to buy it. And we contributed to that inquiry, but we were pretty shocked when we read the report that was published towards the end of that year, because what it highlighted was that when families cannot access infant formula, they're forced into unsafe infant feeding practices. So that could include things like watering down formula, extending the time period between feeds, or even feeding babies inappropriate milks like cow's milk or condensed milk. So it was quite a shocking thing for us to realise that that's what was happening. So that kind of kick-started a bit of activity. People thinking, well, what's happening here? Where are the supports for families and the organisations that are supposed to look after them? And we started doing a wee bit of digging around the subject. And what you see here in this slide is the policies and the research that's kind of come off the back of that I'll talk you through today. So the first thing that we became aware of from talking to the people on the ground that were really facing this was that the existing support systems and policies that were in place just weren't working for families, and in particular those who had formula-fed babies and were living in food insecurity. So we wanted to take a look at what are the policies and supports that are available, what is happening right now, and how can families access help. You can see the aims up here in the slide of the review that was conducted in 2020. Now, at the time, to acknowledge that only policies or guidance available to families and healthcare professionals around this issue were by the Baby Feeding Law Group, who had produced an information worksheet, and UNICEF UK, who had an info sheet on provision of infant formula food banks. So both of these documents very much focus on providing formula via third sector organisations to families who come to them seeking help to feed their babies. So I just selected some key points that were in the document, and I'm going to read directly from my notes here. The stated aim of the Baby Feeding Law Group Toolkit was, and I quote, "This resource aims to encourage organisers and volunteers working in food banks to ensure that food bank donations and information given to mothers and families do not inadvertently undermine breastfeeding and harm infant and young child health." Now, I don't know about you, but I guess we weren't expecting the end of that aim to go where it went. This is a document that's been provided to food banks and other third sector organisations to help them supporting pregnant women and families with infants who cannot feed their babies, and yet they seem to be very focused on not undermining breastfeeding. That does not help the mum with a formula-fed baby who cannot access formula. And you can see as well, from within that document, they were very, very clear in the recommendation that food initiatives should not accept or encourage donations of infant formula. And via some of their case studies, they suggested that the correct thing to do in the case of being given a donation of formula was that the food bank should dispose of it. UNICEF UK guidelines had a similar recommendation. So in 2014, the first iteration of what is now the UNICEF UK info sheet on the provision of formula at food banks was developed, and it existed back then as the Baby Friendly Initiative Statement on the provision of food banks. And you can see for the slide there, again, they were very clear that formula milk should not be given to the mother for her infant, and the emphasis there is very much UNICEF's emphasis. Now, following our research and discussions about this issue, against the backdrop of rising reliance on food charity as a way to feed their babies, UNICEF have definitely softened the language around this recommendation, and in the subsequent updates to that policy, they have added a lot of context, they've added information to our guidance, but they have not changed their advice that food banks do not accept donations of infant formula, nor distribute it to formula-fed babies in food poverty. And as of today, that is still the guidance within that policy document. So what should we do then? If we can't provide formula at food banks, what do UNICEF recommend that we do? And actually, just before I go on, I want to state that as far as I'm aware, the Baby Feeding Law Group Toolkit has now been withdrawn. It's no longer available on their website, although if you search for guidance on provision of food bank formula online, it does still appear in the websites of other infant feeding organisations, usually smaller organisations. So as we stand today, it's the UNICEF info sheet that is the current guidance, and they have produced subsequent guidance since our research has been published. But basically their advice was, if a family comes to you and asks for formula, then you should send them to the health visitor or another healthcare professional and highlight to them all of the financial benefits that are available to them, which absolutely sounds in the face of it like it's good advice, but in reality, it does not work for families. And, one of the first things we did when we looked at the support available was to get on the phone and ring every local authority in Scotland and ask them, what's your emergency formula provision pathway? You can see for the data, some of them didn't even reply. Of those who did reply, 9% of them did not know what we were talking about and didn't have a formula provision pathway. And of the ones who did have a formula provision pathway, almost 2/3 of them included referral to food banks for provision of formula. So we were in this real catch-22 situation where if a family went to the food bank asking for formula to feed their baby, the recommendations from UNICEF UK is that they go to the local authority, who will then just refer them straight back to the food bank, and so on it goes. What about the financial support schemes then? Well, unfortunately, the story doesn't get much better there. Our research really highlighted that the financial support schemes are failing families, because if you do meet the eligibility requirements, and we know that more recently, a lot of families that are now facing food poverty do not meet those eligibility requirements. We're seeing more and more working families in food poverty. So jumping through that first hoop is significant. If you do meet the eligibility requirements, it can take quite a long time to actually get money in your pocket. As standard, this is not just because of delays and high demand for these systems. For some of the initiatives, you could be waiting 6 weeks to actually receive a payment. So it's not an immediate solution to the problem. And then once you get the money, it's actually not enough to cover the cost of feeding a baby. So there were and still are quite clear failings in the financial support systems that were available for families. The upshot of all of this is that the failures in the system, alongside the policies within this area, actually did the opposite to what they were supposed to do. They have created a reliance on food banks. So families have become reliant on food banks to provide formula, but because of the guidance, some food banks don't actually know whether they're allowed to give formula and whether they're not, so postcode lottery type situation. But more worrying than that is that the healthcare professionals are also forced to rely on the food banks for provision formula. So one of the big things that came out of the inquiry we did in 2022 was that health visitors are relying on food banks to help them safeguard the health of the women and babies that are in their care. And again, coming back to the policy issue, because at least in Scotland, all of our health visiting services are baby friendly accredited, this is creating a real tension between the health visitors themselves, who are kind of duty bound and want to adhere to the guidelines that their employer, the NHS, has signed up to, with this absolute contrast to the reality of the situation and being able to help the families that they're working with. So what has arisen from this is basically an under the table dealing of formula between health visitors and some social workers and food banks. And we've got evidence of food banks actually creating code words that health visitors can put on the referral documents so that they're not seen to be asking for formula, but the food banks know that when this request is made in the document, that the health visitors is asking for formula. So we have to consider that when we're writing these policies and giving families advice. We're very good at saying, if you've got any infant-feeding issues, go and speak to your health visitor. But unless we resource the health visitor and give them the guidance, the policies and the capacity to actually support the women, we're just creating, you know, a bottleneck and a bigger issue. So basically, the policies within this field at the moment are completely at odds with reality. And I think the quote here on the right-hand side of the slide kind of suggests why that may be. It's a very privileged point of view to impose breastfeeding on a group of people by depriving them of easy access to formula. Groups are speaking on behalf of people who access formula by deciding for them that they shouldn't have access instead of asking them and giving them the option. So this really has thrown up for myself and Rosie, my colleague at Feed, the question of who was asked and who wasn't. Who informs policy decision making? Was a bit of plain words, plain words there. So when we are creating policies at Feed, this is the framework that we work within, and Rosie created this. She's a public health register, so she's really got a good handle on this. So our approach is what we feel rightly to put the mum and baby very much at the centre. And then as we move outwards, we have to consider the stakeholders who are slightly more far removed from the policy, from the end users. So we've got the healthcare and third sector organisations that the mum and baby will deal directly with. And then further out from that, you've got the policy makers and the rule makers who dictate how the healthcare workers and the third sector organisations can operate. And then further out for there, we've got, I guess, the influencers, UNICEF, people like, you know, academics, others who are trying to influence the government and the policy makers so that their perspectives and their aims filter back in through those concentric circles to the mum and baby at the centre. So we very much take what we call an inside-out approach. We start in the middle and we work our way out. But, and I don't know this, I'm absolutely speculating here, but from the research that we've uncovered, it seems that perhaps when it comes to emergency formula access for infants and food insecurity, the policies have been maybe developed in a more outside-in way, because they seem to be working quite well for those in the outer edges of these circles and not very well for the people that are closer to the centre. So I guess it goes without saying that in policy development, stakeholder engagement is key. If you do not include the people for whom the policies are intended to support within your development process, you're going to end up with something that's not fit for purpose. And I've listed here some of the unintended consequences of this. And in this particular example, looking at formula provision, we've got additional hoops that parents now need to jump through. They go to the food bank as a last resort, expecting that somebody there is finally going to open that door and hand them a tub of formula, and then they've got another hoop to jump through. Sorry, we can't help you, you have to go to the health visitor. Or in some cases, here's some money, now you have to go on the bus and go to the shop and buy the formula. This is just delaying the time to feed a baby, and it's not something that we can actually delay. The other unintended consequence of this is that there is a huge group of women who have been completely neglected. As we focus on who should be giving out formula, who should be giving out formula, we've neglected breastfeeding women. And again, I think this comes back to what's been discussed this morning, is that there is a kind of section that want to breastfeed babies because their food's on tap. Mums get the good stuff, it's always nutritionally adequate and there in sufficient quantities to provide a food source for that infant. Well, the bad news is that actually the limited data that we've got on this suggests that that's not the case. The data from Professor Leslie Frank in Canada, who has led the way in looking at food insecurity in infants in rich nations. And what her research has shown is that despite initiating breastfeeding at the same rate as food secure mothers, women who are food insecure are much more likely to reduce or stop breastfeeding. They've got distinct needs within this area that are currently not being met by policy now. Again, we've touched on some of the issues with financially insecure, you have to go back to work. If you're stressed, that's going to have a physiological impact, and of course, you need to be well nourished yourself to be able to provide breast milk in a quantity and a quality that's going to sustain your infant. The idea of breastfeeding being a cost-efficient way to provide food for your baby is also challenged by Professor Frank's research. It's very much not free. And when they looked at the costs financially of producing a basic nutritious diet for the whole family, with everything else being equal, the difference between a family where the baby was exclusively breastfed versus a family who was exclusively formula fed, well, the baby was exclusively formula fed, worked out at around £18 a month. And that's probably not an insignificant amount if you're really struggling, where a penny is going to help, but it's certainly not the huge cost saving endeavour that we're led to believe that breastfeeding can be. And I think by neglecting breastfeeding women and by providing this type of message, we are basically, this is just another example of how we're setting these women up to fail. So we've very much focused on who should be giving out formula and absolutely ignores the needs of breastfeeding women and their babies. So what do we do about it then? I mean, it is quite a multifactorial issue. And I think where we've been going wrong really is that this issue has been very much approached through the lens of infant feeding, which we all know are very rose tinted. And I think we need to start looking at it as more of an issue of food poverty. And actually, even to boil it right down to the bones, it's a poverty issue. So if we take a step back and look at how we can resolve the issue of poverty and put enough money in the pockets of families to feed their babies, then the infant feeding side of things will sort itself out. And again, from our research, the issue of babies and meeting their rights to food way outstrips any relatively trivial concerns about whether that food comes from a breast or a bottle. People want babies to be fed. So we need a bit of a multifaceted approach, and it is quite high level. I think the responsibility for this lies with the policymakers and the government. But I think while the wheels of politics are turning and we know that this takes a long time, we can also take small actions as well to try and help alleviate this issue. And that could include, something as simple as sticking a tub of first infant formula into the donation bin the next time you're doing your shopping. Telling your local food bank that actually Feed have produced some excellent guidelines on how you can safely provide formula. Asking retailers to let mums and families know that the least expensive formula is just as nutritionally adequate for your baby as the most expensive one. So overall, not one of these actions is actually going to solve the problem, but we just need to keep chipping away and shouting about this issue so that the people in power, you know, the further out of the rings we go, actually start listening and making changes that will make a difference to families. Thank you.
Okay.
Animation too.
Let's see, hello Vera.
Yeah, we're gonna pay the market. With Vera.
Yeah, hey, sorry, I was just minimizing my live tweeting of the event. Yes, thank you for listening to me. My name is Vera Wilde, and I'm here to talk to you about exclusive breastfeeding. Oh, can you see? Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
It is showing? It is sharing? Sorry? Here. Is it sharing now?
Oh, great.
Sorry, I can't see the chat now. Is the screen share working?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Super. There we go. Presenter view. Presenter view. Great. Exclusive breastfeeding, bad science, risky practice, and failed policy. Goodhart's law from British economist Charles Goodhart states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Overall, my argument is that we need to refocus. Oh, where did it go? Come back. Sorry. I don't know why it closed, but I'll get it back. I'll just reopen that and remaximize and come on. Frame. Presenter view. Sorry about that. Right. So the often misplaced focus on breastfeeding metrics over health fits into the larger bureaucratization and professionalization problem. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just seeing that it didn't have my video. I don't know if that needs to be there, but that's there now. Right. Where in the 20th century, reformers have often harmed quality of care and service by trying to standardize and advance it. And these efforts have often been more about power and money than science and ethics. This is Wittgenstein's famous drawing that is a rabbit with the ears going one way, if you look at it in one way, and a duck with the bill going out, if you look at it the other way. And it illustrates the problem of interpretation in cognitive science, art, and also statistics, because even across sciences, two ways of looking at the same observations or the same model can give you different stories or features. Sorry, I don't know why that's crashing. That's never happened before, but we'll just try it again. Right. Here is rabbit duck in the context of infant feeding, where on one side, the breast is best discourse suggests that there's one optimal way to do infant feeding, and that's exclusive breastfeeding. And on the other side, it's possible to interpret the same data to suggest that just feeding the baby, just ensuring sufficiency is really the priority medically and should be the priority in policy terms. This is a basic interpretive problem that plagues infant feeding research, including the Adams et al. Scottish special ed study that was mentioned earlier, the famous Probit Belarusian 1990s cluster randomized trial. And the problem is that it may be that the evidence reflects causal benefits of breastfeeding. It may also be that it actually reflects harm of attempted exclusive breastfeeding or some other facet of the paradigm being studied, and not breastfeeding benefits at all. This is part of a larger so-called science crisis, wherein often researchers make scientific claims on the basis of correlation without regard for causation, which is sort of the opposite of how we should be doing science, according to leading science reformer Richard McElreath, director of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, who says we need to be doing science before statistics, building on Yuta Pearl's work, bringing the causal inference revolution to all sciences by combining graph theory and probability theory. So in this sense, infant feeding is a not sui generis. It is really a wall-to-wall facade of pseudoscientific bullshit, but that's not to say that it's special, right? This is just part of complex modern societies thinking that we're really great and progressive and doing things that are evidence-based when we're not, right? Might doesn't make right. Just because it's the status quo doesn't mean that it's progressive. The problem more specifically in infant feeding science. I'm assuming that you can hear me and that I'm just having problems with the Chrome crashing repeatedly for some reason. Okay, I'm gonna keep getting my slides back when it crashes because that's kind of an essential component. And I apologize, I've never had this problem before, but that's how it goes. So here we are. In infant feeding science, the main methodological problem is that there is an idealized view of the experiment of exclusive breastfeeding in which women are as if randomly assigned to do this. And it's a binary thing that they do or don't do. And then there are health outcomes that are associated, and we can infer causation from these correlations. That's not a reality-based idea of breastfeeding, because in reality, different things cause women to exclusively breastfeed or not, and different things lead it to fail disproportionately in some cases. In particular, maternal health is an often under-recognized confound driving breastfeeding outcomes. So it may not be that breast is best, it may be that having a healthy mom leads to better child health outcomes, and we wouldn't be able to distinguish those two causal stories on the basis of existing observational data. So more specifically, the health selection effects that I'm talking about include things like disordered glucose metabolism in women, as in gestational diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and that plus the endocrinological disorder in polycystic ovarian syndrome. And also things like having had a particularly long or painful birth, maternal lupus, things that are associated with fatigue. Those are all associated with breastfeeding problems, with worse lactation, which is not really surprising because lactation is the most metabolically intensive activity the human body can attempt. So if you're not in great metabolic health, then you have a heightened risk of breastfeeding insufficiencies. Worse neonatal health can also play a role in breastfeeding problems. So this is a representation of a causal diagram and a way to do better science, putting science before statistics. And what it shows is that there's some selection variable X or set of variables that leads women to exclusively breastfeed or not. And then there's an interplay between exclusive breastfeeding and neonatal starvation, where the causal arrow goes both ways. Babies who are effectively starved for a few days before mother's milk comes in, normally a full 48 hours after birth, may not have, for example, the muscle strength to suck to empty milk ducts. And so that's a way in which the current paradigm may actually, ironically, undermine breastfeeding. Similarly, exclusive breastfeeding and maternal health have arrows going both ways, maternal health and child health, and exclusive breastfeeding and child health. So normal infant feeding science is only looking at the causal arrow between exclusive breastfeeding and child health, but that's not a reality-based way of thinking about this picture at all. This kind of confounding is called conditioning on post-treatment variables or post-treatment bias. This critique is an example of something that's a big problem in epidemiology, and stratifying on post-treatment variables can mess up a lot of designs. So the takeaway is that difficulty in sorting out causality means we should think about infant feeding, just like Erin was saying, on a harm prevention model instead of a policy paternalism one. The current infant feeding conversation, however, frames exclusive breastfeeding versus alternatives as a choice between benefits and risks, frames that as a binary choice, and frames the causal effects as certain. But a better conversation would talk about these outcomes as possible risks and possible benefits, would inform women that prelacteal feeding is an option, that exclusive breastfeeding can occur with and without a delay that's really substantial in some cases. For example, for first-time mothers, in one study, they found that 33 to 44% of first-time mothers reported their milk coming in over 72 hours after birth. So that's 3 full days of an infant having insufficient nutrition and hydration. And you don't get to choose if that's the intervention that you're giving your baby. That's something that happens unpredictably to some extent. And there's also space in the conversation to improve the way we talk about mixed feeding, where even some leading experts frame it in terms of very limited mixed feeding in combination with breastfeeding. For example, the picture here is the Freedom of Information Act results on my website from the early limited formula trials conducted by Valerie Fleierman and colleagues, in which they gave infants who had already lost quite a bit of weight a strictly limited 10 milliliters of formula per breastfeeding session. And they still had preventable rehospitalizations of infants in these studies because they were underfeeding them. And there was no disclosure to the Institutional Review Board or to the funder, the Department of Health and Human Services in the US, because this was federally funded. There was no disclosure of possible risks associated with these rehospitalizations with starvation. Oops. So what's missing here is safety infrastructure. And the reason that it's missing is that previous advanced civilizations recognized that breastfeeding insufficiencies were really common, and they had an infrastructure to solve that problem that we accidentally destroyed. For example, wet nursing as a well-organized profession has existed in every previous advanced civilization. And as women moved to the cities and increasingly were working outside the home, that was dismantled just in the course of these huge social shifts. And similarly, the unique demographic shift to childbearing later and less of modernity has meant that new mothers no longer typically have a built-in social support network of lactating kin. So it used to be that new younger mothers would have older mothers or women in their immediate support network, family network, who are at risk of breastfeeding problems, but they would have younger women around them lactating. First-time mothers are at greater risk of breastfeeding problems, but they would have older women around them lactating, and that's gone. Chief among the reimagining mistakes we made when late 20th century reformers were trying to bring breastfeeding back after a few generations away from breastfeeding as the normal infant feeding practice was they thought that the idea of breastfeeding meant this particular idea of exclusive breastfeeding, That also turns out to be historically unprecedented in the context of this collapsed safety infrastructure that created a single point of failure. The way that we think about exclusivity in the context of breastfeeding is a myth, and it has similarities to the story of the Garden of Eden and the fall. It is predicated on this idea that before formula, exclusive breastfeeding was universal and it was fail-safe. What we know now is that that sets up a number of false oppositions, not just between breastfeeding and formula, the exclusivity of the milk itself, but also prelacteal feeding versus breastfeeding, when that was not considered those things were not considered opposed, but rather supporting in many previous traditions. The idea that there's one mother, one baby, in contexts where there was shared, especially familial nursing, that's not a universal cultural instantiation of breastfeeding practices at all. And the idea that supplementing necessarily undermines instead of supporting breastfeeding is another really surprisingly recent false opposition. Hoffander, for example, found that when Sweden was implementing baby-friendly throughout their hospitals, some hospitals were routinely supplementing less than 10% of healthy neonates until mother's milk came in, while in the others, up to 90% were supplemented. So there was a great deal of heterogeneity in terms of what exclusive breastfeeding meant at the beginning with baby-friendly, and the shift was made top-down to this new conception without sufficient evidence in terms of safety or implications or any evidentiary basis. So the exclusivity reality is that these infant feeding practices are particularly dangerous in the first days, where there's near universal insufficiency, which is worst in first-time mothers, and suggests that it's at least possible that previously widespread colostrum taboos against feeding infants colostrum that were in many cultures, may have been what's called a Chesterton's fence in anthropology, where we think a practice is adaptive, or we think there's no reason for it. We bulldoze the fence, we do away with the practice, but it turns out we didn't know what it was there for, and it was serving a purpose. So the colostrum taboo may have protected some infants from, on the extreme end of risks, sudden unexpected postnatal collapse events, where there's cutting-edge research coming out of Sweden on how infants, particularly on first-time mothers' breasts, face down, may have basically systemic collapse that's life-threatening. And waiting to initiate breastfeeding would have prevented this type of tragic event. But the danger then continues past the first few days of life. And that danger is unequal along racial and developmental lines in exactly the ways that disparities are traditionally fall. Some of the reasons are that African and Asian neonates have a heightened susceptibility to permanent brain damage and death from neonatal jaundice. For example, African Americans have a higher rate of kernicterus, which is a very severe form of permanent brain damage from neonatal jaundice. And the treatment, the protection against this type of complication is formula feeding. Sugar water doesn't work as well. Formula increases the baby's ability to excrete bilirubin. And it's also, it seems to be safer than phototherapy, which may be associated with increased risk of autism, and replaced the previous generation's norm of formula feeding jaundiced babies, again, without evidence that it was safe. There's also evidence from a recent promised exclusive breastfeeding promotion trial in sub-Saharan Africa showing an increase in neonatal deaths, wasting, and possibly lower IQ. So there was no proven trade-off of benefit for substantial possible risks from the intervention. I've been focused on neonatal harms just because of time constraints, but I also want to mention maternal risks, mental health being a big one. The postnatal period is very risky for women, and to be exposed to, pain. It's 50% of women report nipple pain from breastfeeding. sleep deprivation, which is worsened when babies don't sleep as well because they're hungry or because they're metabolizing breastfeeding faster than they metabolize formula, and excessive infant crying and sleep deprivation are all predictors of postnatal depression. And so where do we go from here? In terms of better practice, the path to putting science before belief is pretty clear. I think it supports prelactial and supplemental feeding, replacing exclusive breastfeeding as current infant feeding norms, evidence-based screening for breastfeeding problems, evidence-based prenatal education, education and support for safer infant feeding, and just overall, to echo Erin and Lina, to listen to people. And the path to better policy that flows from that is having systematic local and state level support for mixed formula feeding, a new international legal regime structuring formula donations, which the WHO 1981 International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, the code effectively prohibits free or low-cost formula donations, even in impoverished HIV endemic and crisis areas. That just doesn't make sense. But we do need a new international legal regime that constrains and cooperates with industry. We might want to discuss public milk provision alternatives and overall support diverse context-dependent safety infrastructures. Infant feeding would be an excellent idea, and we can do it on a harm prevention model with better science and better ethics.